I'd like to welcome you to the best argument there is for the existence of God. You can scour YouTube long and hard, you'll find an array of theists presenting their best arguments for the existence of God. What I intend to present to you today is my best argument for the existence of God, and not just any God, an omniscient, omnipotent deity who created our universe. Now, I hope that's a sufficient opener to pique your interest, so without further ado, let's present the argument. Now, every religious argument seems to contain at least one basic tenet, and unless you're prepared to accept that tenet, then the whole argument isn't going to seem very plausible to you. The central tenet of this argument is that with sufficient technology, it would be possible to create an artificial consciousness, an artificial intelligence along the lines of ourselves. Now, I realise for some people they'll already be finding this a stumbling block. Certainly if you have a very religious perspective and you believe in an immortal or immaterial soul, or perhaps you have a sort of spiritual idea that there's some kind of magical life energy that must be imbued into matter to give it life, then you're going to have a problem with it. But if you take a broadly evolutionary perspective, and that our brains have evolved basically as very, very complicated multi-parallel neural networks, then really there's nothing to really ward off this idea that if you have sufficient technology and the know-how to go with it, that you could create an artificial consciousness. Now, if you look at the kind of things that people do nowadays, play games like Spore and The Sims, which is tremendously popular, and the interest we have in virtual worlds. It seems to me almost goes without saying that if we could create this kind of artificial consciousness, one thing we'd want to do is to populate very, very complex virtual worlds with these consciousnesses. Well, this is the basic premise then, that you could have, if you had sufficient technology, virtual worlds with virtual consciousnesses in them. What we're talking about is a virtual universe, not a real universe, but a virtual universe populated with virtual consciousnesses. If you was in such a virtual universe, of course, you would have no idea that you was in a virtual universe. It would seem just as real as our universe seems to us. This is the very point, this will be the very point of the programming of the virtual universe itself. So how does this get us back to our argument? How does this make this such a good argument for the existence of a deity? Well, the thing is, if we could, with sufficient technology and sufficient knowledge, create such a universe, then in another universe, another sentient life form such as ourselves could do exactly the same thing. In fact, if you believe in some kind of multiverse idea, that there are many, many universes, many of which may have sentient intelligences much like ourselves, then many of those sentient intelligences may be doing just this thing. May be creating artificial universes, virtual worlds, with artificial consciousnesses living within them. So why, again I ask, does this make this a particularly good argument for God? Well, the reason is this. Is because if we could do it once, we could do it 10 times, we could do it 100 times. The chances are, if we were to try and make such a simulation, such a universe simulation, we would do it more than once. And so this is where the argument has gotten really interesting, because the upshot of it is that if this is true, the number of real universes that contain sentient intelligences is going to be less than the number of virtual universes that contain sentient intelligences. So on a purely statistical level, we are more likely ourselves to be in one of those virtual universes, a universe that's been created by a pre-existing sentient intelligence, than in one of the real universes themselves. I hope that's clear. I hope I've made that point nice and clear there. Now, this is quite an interesting argument, and we can learn quite a lot about different things from looking at this argument, I think. But before we get on to the really interesting stuff, let's just look at where this stands. The first thing to realise is that this is not a theory. okay, because it's not falsifiable. It stands along similar grounds to a lot of theological arguments for the existence of God. It cannot be disproven. You either take it as an article of faith or you don't. And in some ways it's very similar to the idea that God created the universe. There's a God created the universe 5 minutes ago, and has given us all false memories of everything that happened in our life prior to that. You know, we can't disprove it, but that doesn't mean we have to believe it or accept it as a sensible argument. So I'm not suggesting that anybody accepts this as a sensible argument, but let's look at the space around this argument and see what interesting questions, what interesting conclusions we can derive from it, because it might tell us a lot about other religious arguments and about other religious ideas. So here goes, let's start having a look around it. I think most of what we can learn, we can glean from trying to understand those that would create this kind of a universe. Firstly, what would their status be within the universe? Well, they would certainly appear to be omniscient and omnipotent. They would be able to alter anything they pretty much wanted to alter, certainly from the perspective of those artificial consciousnesses within the universe. The same thing about quizzing the universe. They could know any of the thoughts of any of the consciousnesses, any of the deeds of any of the consciousnesses, fantastic amounts of statistical information about what's going on within the universe. They would certainly appear to those in the universe to be omniscient and omnipotent. What about the idea of existing outside of time or being timeless? Well, certainly with respect to that universe, the creator of that universe would exist outside of time. They would be able to view the time scale, the time frame as a timeline, and look at different points along the timeline and inject different things into the timeline. Now, of course, if you inject something earlier into the timeline, you'd have to run your simulation again from that point. So you certainly don't have that level of omnipotence. But clearly, you're not existing within the local time of this universe, and so in that respect you're existing outside of time. But what about if we look at the organism itself that's created this universe? Well, itself, it doesn't have to be in its own universe omnipotent and omniscient. In fact, it really wouldn't be. It would be no more omniscient and omnipotent than you and I. In fact, it could actually be, if we were born 10,000 years' time, you or I. That's how limited that deity could be. It certainly wouldn't be outside of time in totality, because it would have to exist in its own time frame. So this is a very interesting idea to explore, because people have very preconceived ideas of what God out there must consist of to have created something like this universe. And yet very quickly I've presented a very mundane perspective on what an ultimate deity for an entire universe, in this case a virtual universe, could consist of, and it lies utterly at odds with the traditional theological perspective of what a deity could be. Of course, this whole argument, this whole simulation argument, is a very recent argument, and with good measure. Nobody could have formulated this argument a couple of thousand years ago, because we didn't have computers, and we didn't even really understand the concepts of a simulation and of being outside of that simulation, and of running software or hardware and all these kinds of things. So we really wouldn't even understand any of these concepts. So this is a very modern argument, but it's a very modern argument that's giving us a very modern insight into these notions of what constitutes a deity. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think I've said enough. I think I've given enough to think about two things really. One is what would constitute a deity, and to challenge and question the traditional ideas of what a deity must have to be like if one did create the universe. And the other thing is to challenge this notion that sometimes comes out that well, if you can't prove something's wrong, then you should kind of believe in it. And this is an example that I've given. This whole video is an example of something that you can't prove it isn't true, but that isn't good grounds really to start walking around believing that we're living in a computer simulation. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to look into it further, this whole idea, this whole argument was formulated by Nick Bostroms, who is a Swedish guy, and he studies out of, he's a professor at Oxford University. I'll put some links in the sidebar so you can go and have a look at some of the stuff that he's put out there, which is infinitely more interesting than what I've done here. But I hope it's given you a bit of an insight, and I hope it's given you a few things to think about. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.